Hey everybody, glad to have you with us. We are doing chapters 4 through 9 of Revelation tonight in Apocalypse Need. Let me just make sure everything's gone live. Just double checking. There we go. I'll give another minute or so since this does officially start at 5 and we got out here a little bit early, but it was so fun seeing everybody last week and getting to talk about the role that the letters to the churches play and how they are representative in many ways of how people react and how groups react in times of stress. So glad we got to discuss that tonight. We're going to look a little bit more at the nature of God, and particularly how God is represented in this stretch and in Revelation in general, and how we feel about God in the midst of times of trial and suffering. And then we will also look at the cyclical nature of time and how we keep repeating things. So, okay, so it's 5 o'clock and I see we've got some folks on here. So I'm going to go ahead and start talking through some of this. And so we'll start out with the section where we're going to talk about who is God and what is God's plan in the midst of this. And I think people have deep questions about God around Revelation. What role does God play in this? There's a lot of bad things that happen in the course of this book, and is God bringing these bad things on, or are other forces bringing these bad things on? And honestly, it's a little sticky. This is a bit of a sticky book when it comes to that. So I want us to wrestle a little bit with the theology of that reminder as well. So, but let me start out by sharing my screen. So let me get to that. And we will take a look at some of these concerns. Okay. So just a reminder for those of you that are joining, you have a couple of different ways. You can stay here on the Facebook Live and you can share comments in the Facebook Live. I cannot promise that I can get to the comments in the Facebook Live until after I've done teaching, but you're welcome to share any comments or questions and I'll respond there. Or if you want to go to Zoom and put in this webinar ID, 936-7995-7360, you can come into a webinar. And I can't see you in the webinar. You come in just as a name. So if you're in your pajamas already, you'd be fine. But you can stay, either be in the webinar for this part and then leave after that, or you can stay and do the Q&A part. We will finish by 6 o'clock or whenever, before that if everybody's done with their questions, but I do invite you to come in on that. So if you want to join us on Zoom, feel free to hop out and come in that way. Love to see you. Otherwise, glad to have you here with us on Facebook. Okay, so here we are, session 3, part 1, who is God and what is God's plan? Remember, we're using memes to kind of illustrate some of these points to help us. It's digital storytelling, help it kind of frame the story for us. And so I want us to remember that when we are looking at the powers that are at work in Revelation, it's not just the powers that are described in Revelation, but this is written in the context of the first century when early Christians are under the pressure of Rome. And in fact, we believe that Revelation was written right around the time when the Temple of Jerusalem was under threat or being attacked, or it was written a little later and it was during a time of persecution of Christians. So one of those two times, either one would have been a dangerous time to be a Christian. So behind this reality, it coded in some of the language, is this pressure of Rome looming over them. So it's one of the reasons that I have this meme about NASA and Pluto, right? Because it particularly makes reference to a Roman god, right? Whenever we talk about demoting Pluto from being a planet, this person responded, look, I'm not saying that demoting a planet named after the Roman god of death stoked his rage and brought down on us his vengeful fury and retribution, but gestures at everything, right? So So remember that pressure of Rome, those powers, those external powers, and when we read this from an idealistic perspective, remember we've got these three or these four different ways of approaching Revelation, and we're mostly coming at from idealist, which is that Revelation just describes typical apocalyptic times. Remember, there are always powers at work in battle in that. So so keep those in the back of your mind. And then, of course, we have this Antichrist figure, which sometimes is associated with Satan. It's really a kind of, it can be a political figure in this space. There's a lot of different ways to interpret it, but we do have this Antichrist figure looming here, this full opposition to God on a cosmic level, on a supernatural level. And so that's why I have the meme there about Satan. But the question is who is in charge here? Who is at work? And so looking specifically at these chapters 4 to 9, I went through and got what descriptions of God we have available. Now, it's a little slippery to determine, because we have two primary figures at work here. One is the one on the throne, and the other is the Lamb. And both of them, we would understand that in Christian terms as being the God, the Creator, and then the Christ figure. In that they are distinct in this story, and we tend to think of them in Trinitarian terms, much more unified in that, but they are kind of distinct beings here in this moment. And so so here's what we have. Here's what we know about the one on the throne. The one on the throne is the one who was, who is, and is coming. The one on the throne is holy. The one on the throne is worthy to receive glory, honor, and power. Now, isn't that interesting that the one on the throne is worthy to receive power? I think we tend to think in terms of the one on the throne has power, but the language here is to receive power, and that is a representation of the powers of the earth needing to bring power to the one on the throne, to give it as sort of as a gift. But it is an interesting kind of twist of phrase there. The one on the throne also created all things. And then this is also interesting wording. The one on the throne receives blessing. So we bless the one on the throne, receives blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might forever. So these are the things that we bring to the one on the throne, but it's interesting because usually I think we think of those as being gifted to us from the one on the throne, and they can work both ways. They can be given to us to return the gift, but it is an interesting passive space for this power in this moment. And then the Lamb is the only one worthy to take the scroll, because the Lamb was slain. And also the Lamb is worthy to receive power, wealth, wisdom, might, honor, glory, and blessing. And it will be the Lamb that will open the scrolls, as well as break the seals. So again, there's this giving to reality in this. And maybe that's because it's in the frame of worship. Much of what we were described in this is very much this worshipful moment. We have the 144,000, well, the ones that are under the throne that need to be clothed in white, are there to worship, but there's others that are coming to worship, and this is the space of worship where all this happens. So perhaps that's why it's this receptive space. For both of them, victory belongs to both of them. So the ending's been given away. In the first few chapters, we know that these two will be victorious, that this is the ultimate destiny. So that should set our mind at ease from the get-go, right? Victory is going to belong to them. Now we're going to see that play out in very rough reality, but we've been told the ending right up the front. Have you ever watched a movie that you knew the ending and yet it still had power? Somebody told me the ending to the movie Glory before I saw Glory, and I wept before the final battle was even started, because I knew what was going to happen. So there can still be something very powerful when you know the ending, just having gone through the reality of telling the story. Okay. And then also they are both collectively worshipped by those who have suffered, and they will be worshipped by others, but they are currently being worshipped by them. Okay. So I want to stop and think. We'll look at these memes and kind of set up this frame of what's going on here with this question of power. Who is doing all the stuff in Revelation? So we have in this stretch, we have the implication that the lamb and or the one on the throne, it's a little bit slippery right there, right? Is unleashing God is unleashing these angels that are going to do damage, but is also limiting the amount of damage that they will do. So there's an unleashing and a limitation at the same time. However, it's a little bit stranger who is unleashing the horses and their riders. And we'll talk about the horses and riders, more specifics about them when we get to the second part of this lesson. But it's the beasts that are at the throne, right, who are calling forth the horses and the riders. So are they doing that on behalf of God, or are they other powers that are bringing this forward? And this is a deep theological question that we have, in the sense of we have this debate of free will and predestination, of if God is all powerful or all loving. All of these are at play. And so those of us who are Methodist, who err on the all loving side and err on the free will side, would push back on this idea that God is orchestrating all of these things. But I have these two memes up here just to kind of think in those terms. One was during, the summer when we had all the protests. Destruction of property is not a valid form of protest. God, and that's obviously Noah's Ark, and the attendant destruction that happened as a result of that. And then the government, you can go back outside if you can act right. And then the Lord, knowing full well how y'all act, it rains every day, right? So obviously there's an implication that God is controlling the weather, orchestrating things, all of that. And that is a theological stance. We do have traditions in Christianity that definitely believe that everything that happens, God does. That means if you're going with that line, then God's responsible for some evil, right? Or at least how we conceive of evil. In that theological framework, they would say we just don't understand what is good and what is evil because we don't have God's vision, and we can't see all of human history and all of world history, all of the eons. So we just don't have that understanding. But some of us say no. We would really push back on that idea that God is responsible for a lot of the horrible things that are happening here. So we have this tension in Revelation, where the one on the throne does seem to have a heavy hand in how things are unfolding, the unrolling of these scrolls, that sort of thing. But there are other voices at work here. Like I said, the four creatures tend to call forth the horses and their riders. But this is overall a tension, like I said, in Christianity between more Calvinist perspectives and more Arminian perspectives. Methodists fall into the Arminian perspective, which is this tension between free will and predestination, right? Now, we can be free will people and still believe that God is ultimately guiding history, that our ultimate destination is assured, because God is moving us to that direction. What we would say in the question of free will, we would say that God has a will, and there are times that we cooperate with God's will. We step into that, and we move in the direction that God would have for us. And that's when the kingdom breaks through. That's when we see real change happening, those sorts of things. That would be our perspective on this. But we would also say that in the end, God's got this. In the end, God's got this. What will be twisty and turny is how we get there. And those twists and turns are due to our free will and our exercise of that free will, and our inability or inattentiveness to be always focused on what God's will is for us. And it's hard to see sometimes what God's will is. So we can still believe that God's working all things to good, but that God has infinite possibilities for us based on the fact that that we all have free will to operate within that. But again, Revelation itself gets a little heavy-handed. Just remember that on some level, Revelation is telling an ultimate story, right? That ultimately God's got this, and ultimately God will work things to good. It's just going to do this in there for us. And so we would attest all of the violence, all of the destruction, that sort of thing, being the nature of other forces at work in the midst of this, and would define it in those terms. But I do also want to say a pastoral note about this reality, because one of the reasons that I want to approach Revelation from an idealist perspective is because it's not just that we have these worldwide apocalypses like we are experiencing in this time and frame, time and place. But we also have, regional apocalypses when, like if there's a tsunami, that's a regional apocalypse. If you might have a local apocalypse if there is some sort of disaster at a factory, for instance. But we can also have personal apocalypses. We can have those events in our own lives that feel world ending. And I will be honest, I've had a rough couple of years, and it's felt like a personal apocalypse. A lot of things are having to change, and I'm having to be in some ways made new in the midst of them. And I will admit that in this time of stress, that I have wanted God to show up and fix everything, and have prayed for that. And have said, look, God, this is it. I feel like this is within your capacity to fix this. So fix it, right? Like, just fix it. And obviously from my theological perspective, I would say, no, I have to cooperate within here. And this is much more complicated, and other people have to cooperate, and God's guiding this, and God will lead us to good. But there is much complication in this space. And I believe that theologically, but pastorally, in that moment of pain and hurt, I just want it fixed. So it's not surprising to me that a book that is dealing with really hard times leans a little bit, to some extent, to God, just fix it. Just get us there, please. And I think that we need to claim the honesty of that very human tendency to want God to come in and just make it all better. And when we are open to God's peace, it does make it all better. It doesn't necessarily fix our external circumstances, but when we can be overwhelmed by God's peace, which is available to us, it's always available to us. Again, it doesn't fix the externals necessarily, but it gives us that center and that peace. But sometimes we want the externals fixed too, and that's a real thing. And so we need to recognize that pastorally, Revelation names some things that sometimes we just need to name, that we want that. Okay. So let's now talk. That's a kind of broad stroke at who God is and what God's plan is ultimately to get us to victory, right? That we've been told at the beginning, victory is coming. We've been told that God is worthy of all these things, and trustworthy. And so we'll get there, but it's going to get messy before we get there. So, and the reason that it's going to get messy is because it always gets messy. So let's talk about why history seems to repeat itself. So let me get back to... So I don't know if you've noticed, but we tend to keep going through the same things over and over as humans. We tend to have a little bit of struggle learning our lessons, right? So, and an apocalypse deals with that reality. An apocalypse recognizes the cyclical nature of history. First of all, the cyclical nature of history points to an ultimate destiny where God will bring us. But it also, because we keep seeing these same things over and over and over again, gives a timelessness to an apocalypse. It can the telling of an apocalypse can drop into any time of stress, because things keep happening that keep happening. So there's some comfort in some ways, or some universality. That's a better way of putting it. There's some universality in the pattern, and that's going to be reflected in Revelation. So I just had to share these. It's really hard to track time in Revelation. It gets really loosey goosey, and I think that is because time doesn't really matter. The dating of things doesn't really matter, and when you're under stress, time has a way of not feeling linear. And we've encountered that in the midst of this pandemic. That's why we have this 37 Juvember meme here, which is like, what day is it? Who knows? What it all starting to run together. It's all overwhelming. Time does that in times of real pressure. Some things also repeat. There are things that tend to show up or tend to be magnified in times of stress, like our insane hurricane season. I mean, we got hit by a hurricane in central Arkansas this past year. That's crazy, right? But hurricane season is a yearly thing. It just had an intensity to it, right? Congratulations, you successfully made it to the end of May. Welcome to Jumanji level 6 hurricane season, right? Which was nuts. And then we're going to see another meme too, a funny one of a repeat of history, but somebody's saying, I want 2020 to be like the roaring 20s. And the earth said, okay, infectious disease is spreading. Well, no, not like that. Okay, the U.S. stock market is saying, okay, wait, okay, LMAO, bars can't be open anymore, right? We had prohibition back then. So we tend to have things that show up over and over and over and over again in our human history. I hope that we're evolving, but there's moments like this where you wonder, really, are we? So let's reflect on the cyclical nature of history. Some things just keep showing up, and some things are common to apocalypses, because honestly, they cause apocalypses. So when there's a hurricane, when there's a tornado, when there's earthquakes, those kinds of things are apocalyptic events. And so, surprise, surprise, they show up in apocalypses because they are apocalypses, right? And then we have the 4 horses and their riders, right? Which there is some debate. They're not necessarily spelled out very clearly. Death is, and war is pretty clearly laid out. But the other 2 is a little bit open to interpretation. So the first one that comes, the white horse with the bow, some will say that's Christ coming. Some will say it's the Antichrist coming, depending on how you interpret it. But either way, some significant figure of great power. And that's always at play in an apocalypse, right? And then war, apocalyptic event, famine, apocalyptic event, death, apocalyptic event, right? Death and pestilence. Those are big apocalypses. Those will have profound impacts on things. So, and those things keep happening in human history. We keep struggling with that. So it's not surprising that these figures show up in our apocalypse. The seals tend to, especially from an idealist perspective, represent the recurring evils in history, and God's presence and ultimate authority over them. Because remember, it's God who is determining that these seals are being opened. It's the Lamb that's actually able to open them. So there's some again role in and how these things play out and when. And then the trumpets are the cycles of human sin, consequences for that sin, and God's salvation within it. And we've seen this all throughout the Bible, right? People will screw up, there will be consequences, and God will move us to a better day. Will try to get us to do better, right? And then I also want us to recognize that Revelation is very much trying to recall Genesis. You're going to see images of Genesis showing up. We've already seen the tree of life show up in this. And now we have these 4 angels at the Euphrates. which the angels were guarding the entrance to the garden, which was around the Euphrates in the story that we have narrated in Genesis 2 and 3. It's around the Euphrates. So we're it's not just a cyclical nature, and it doesn't just do this all through history. This is bookending all of history, right? We are recalling the beginning of the story, and we're going to cap it off at the end of the story. So watch for elements of Genesis to come up as well. And then remember that apocalypses are kind of been there, done that, right? Because we all go through times of stress and trial and tribulation. There's some things that feel repetitive to them because they tend to show up over and over and over in apocalypses. And then I just loved this meme when we have the dust storms coming through. The person who responded, "Awesome. I always wondered what it was like to live during the times of the Civil War, Spanish flu, Great Depression, Civil Rights Movement, Watergate, and the Dust Bowl. Not all at once, mind you. But beggars, choosers, and all." Like, it's really felt intense. It really has. But apocalypses are intense. Apocalypses do kind of reflect that reality. So it does make sense that these things show up over and over and over again because they are themselves apocalyptic. Okay. Just loved these memes. 2020 is everything 2012 wanted to be. Remember when we were all afraid of 2012? Oh, it's so cute, right? And then the December 31st, 2020, 11:59 p.m., December 31st, 2020, 11:60 p.m., right? Like that time is just stopping and cycling over and over and over and over again. And then scientists find 33 creatures living in a cave that was sealed off for 5 million years. Seal that cave back up and walk away. This is not the year, man. Right? Let's not uncap anymore. We've already seen so much. So just some fun things. Okay. Well, these are the sections that I wanted to talk about for today to kind of cover. Next week, we are going to do chapters 10 to 17. We're going to look at the pressures of leadership, that there's conflict within leadership in an apocalypse. And we're going to look at the fact that we got to still tell the good news even in the midst of the bad news. So we will have those dual pressures. So read chapters 10 to 17. And then I also, if any of you want to hop in and join us for the question and answer portion, maybe you've got some questions you want to kind of unpack what we talked about God, then feel free to hop in on the Zoom. Remember the webinar ID is 936-7995-7360. I also encourage you, if you've got anyone who you think might benefit from these talks, feel free to share them, and would love to have them along next week. So next week we'll be back together at 5 o'clock. It's been a joy being with you all again, talking through Revelation. If you want to come in with us, like I said, hop in on the webinar, and otherwise I will see you next week. And those of you in the Q&A, I'll be right there with you.